Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webcast, which will focus on information every Idaho employer should know when reactivating or reopening its business. My name is Jason Castor, and I'm the Chief Business Development Officer for the law firm of Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer. And I'd like to extend a huge thanks to all of you for getting up bright and early and spending an hour of your busy morning with us today. I'd also like to extend a big thanks to Justy Thomas and HRATV for co-hosting today's webinar. We recognize that all of us and all of you are dealing with very challenging times with respect to your business, and our hope today is that we can provide you with practical guidance to assist you through these challenging times. Before we get into the substantive presentation today, I want to touch base just quickly on the format of today's presentation. All of your lines will be muted. That said, we would like to encourage you to submit questions through the chat feature to me, the host, Jason Castor, or to any one of our panelists. We'd like to make this session as interactive as we possibly can today while still going through the content and the information that we've prepared for you. Today's webinar is being recorded, and all of the slides will be shared with you at the end of our presentation today. Typically what happens with this webinar, with the recording, is that it takes about 12 hours for it to download and become available through WebEx. So you should get an email tomorrow with a recording link to today's webinar along with the slide deck. Before we move into this substantive portion of the presentation, I must start with a legal disclaimer. Today's presentation is a source of general information, should not be considered legal advice. If you have any questions about how this information relates to your business, you must consult with your legal counsel. So now that we've gone through the formalities of this, I'd like to turn the time over to Justy Thomas, the board president of HRATV, with some welcoming remarks. Justy, thanks a lot for having us today, and I'll turn the mic to you. And I'm going to unmute you, Justy.
Good morning, and thank you, Jason. I appreciate this opportunity to partner with you all. And good morning and welcome to everybody on the line with us today. As Jason mentioned, my name is Justy Thomas. I've volunteered with the HRATV since 2013, and I am honored to represent the organization as board president this year. Last week, we presented an HR executive panel who talked about return to workplace strategies and general HR leadership. Today's session is meant to augment last week's meeting with more specific compliance and legal guidance regarding returning our workforce back to their offices. At the conclusion of today's event, you will receive a brief survey. Your opinion matters to us, so please take a minute or two to offer your feedback. Jason, with that said, I'll turn the presentation back to you. Thank you.
Great, Justy, and thanks to you and your team and your board at HRATV for having us again today. We appreciate the opportunity. Let's kick off our presentation today. I'm going to turn the time over to Amy Lombardo, a shareholder out of our Boise office. Amy's going to kick off today's presentation talking about Idaho's roadmap with respect to returning to work. Amy?
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everyone. So we will start with the status that we are in now in Idaho. Idaho's reopen plan is a 4-stage plan, and this has been laid out and reported in the news. You should always remember, however, that for the 4 stages, it's not going to necessarily be linear. We hope it will be, but you may at some time need to plan and prepare to go back to stage 1 or even prior to stage 1. But hopefully, the governor will announce tomorrow that we'll be entering stage 2. So what does that mean for employers? You should, the basics are, you should continue to telework whenever possible, and that will become the importance of that will become far more clear as we go through the presentation today. And I should say we have a great deal of information to cover, so we are going to try to go quickly, but if you have any questions about anything, please let us know. So second, you should consider and look into returning employees to work in phases. And that is because you must have the physical distancing, personal protections, and sanitation options ready and available when you return your employees to work. You should note that in Idaho, the physical distancing of people in the office or outside of the office is required through stage 4. So the entire plan through the end of June, it's required. And then we'll talk a little bit more about vulnerable persons, but vulnerable people should not potentially return to work until at least June 13th, and then only with accommodations. So this is the sort of roadmap that I will be going over and that some of my partners will be going over. So first, you need to set up a decision team. And that should include, many of you have already probably done this, and you know by now who your key people are who will be making these decisions. But you should also kind of set up what triggering items will lead to the decision team needing to have a meeting. What is the outlook for that decision team going forward through this entire thing, including return to whatever our new normal will be. One thing we've been advising people to do is asking employers to include kind of a diverse group of people in this decision team. And you may have one core team and then even a larger team, so that you can include people from the front lines of your employment, people from different departments, people with different expertise. You may need someone from IT, someone from HR, legal. You may want, you'll want to look at the diversity of the team. So different genders, ethnic makeups, and anyone from the CEO to someone who sits at the front desk. You want to have a lot of input and different decision makers involved. You can go to the next slide, Jason. So the things to consider as you are kind of drafting your plan to return to work are leadership. And you all talked about this. I was on the presentation last week. The tone from the top is so important, and even more important these days. So where the guidelines suggest, if your office decides to do something like wear face coverings or work remotely, it's pretty clear to everyone around if leadership is doing that or not doing it. It's a great opportunity that leaders and managers have right now to demonstrate compliance and to show the attitude and the culture of your workplace. Communication, we advise employers to over-communicate because there's always the danger that normally the danger is office gossip, but now with people, so many people talking about nothing else, if your company isn't telling employees how we're going to do things, they will still be talking about it. And that's the same for your customers or clients or vendors. Other people will talk a lot today about documentation and confidentiality. And I think you all talked about mental health last week. But in the HR world, this has never been more important. There have been people in the mental health space are estimating that there will be a great deal of fallout from this for children and for adults. And whether you're, more annoyed at the government than usual, or just really upset that you're stuck inside your house, the office should, keep lines of communication open and be aware of these issues. So next is identify the relevant data and guidance. And this is surprisingly difficult because you need to look at the CDC, OSHA guidance, state and local guidance. For this group, the relevant guidance is the Central and the Southwest Health Department for the Treasure Valley. There's guidance there on their websites as well. Look to the best practices of your industry, and putting all of this together and marrying up, sort of state guidance with city guidance, with health department guidance can be tricky. So, and it's also continually changing. Also, I should mention the CDC. So OSHA guidelines mention that you should follow the CDC recommendations. And I believe the EEOC's guidance says this as well. And then the CDC recommendation, or the OSHA recommendations, also reference the presidential guidelines for opening up America again. Those have been not they were talked about for a little while, but now more people are focused on the state plans. Your state plan probably follows, to some extent, the presidential guidelines, but sometimes there's information there you need to be aware of as well. So as I was going through how to best present this, OSHA has a long document that lists all of these things that you should do to be prepared. And so employers should incorporate the local guidance into the specific plan for your workplace. And I've included this as a reference, but there are a couple of things like, so all businesses may not have an infectious disease preparedness and response plan already, but part of going through that exercise is looking at doing a hazard analysis and looking at how and where the workers in your workplace might be exposed. So what are the sources of exposure? How may they come in contact with the virus? And this, you should also include an assessment of, customers and coworkers, and the general public can all be sources of exposure for your employees. You should look at, you're advised to look at non-occupational risk factors at home and in your community. So that we will talk about the difficulty in doing that a little later. But essentially, you may need to look at the population of your workforce and see what their risk factors are. So if if you have people who are married to doctors or nurses, if you have people who have another job that is in the healthcare arena, you may need to assess all of those things. You should consider the worker's individual risk factors like age and medical conditions, and we will get into all of the issues with that. But overall, OSHA advises to follow the existing standards as well. And so look to the general duty clause, as you all are probably aware, requires employees to furnish each worker with a space free of recognized hazards. As you're doing this level of risk analysis, you should realize that it depends on your industry. So most, I would say, general office workers will be in this lower risk or medium risk. Well, so generally office workers will be in the lower risk category. And the language is office workers who do not have frequent close contact with coworkers, customers, or the public. And I'll say that it depends on your industry, but it also depends on an individual's job type and on what they are doing as part of their job. So, you know, maybe your customer-facing people might be at a higher risk than people in your back office. If you are in the medical industry, you will be in high or very high, depending on if you're just going into a patient's room or if what you do involves something with, the best way I think of it is something with like saliva, or if, you know, if you're dealing with respiration. Dentist office, I think it has specific guidance, and they may be on the very high end. So look at those things when you're deciding what level of controls you need to put in your workplace. And then, so OSHA gives you a framework for deciding, and this is actually, sorry, NIOSH gives you a framework for determining how best to get rid of the hazard. So when you're looking at which things should I do and which are more effective, here you're not going to be able to eliminate or substitute the hazard because it's a virus. But engineering controls and administrative controls are things like, you know, isolating people from the hazard, changing the way people work, and then the last thing to do is personal protective equipment. So this is why kind of staging the number of people or who's in your office, or if anyone is in your office, is far more effective, obviously, than personal protective equipment. So I will not talk very much about plans or policies, but I've just kind of included a list of things to consider. We have been developing and drafting policies, science, and we'll have other people talk about this a little bit more. So next, what you should do is prepare your physical space. And this goes back to, you know, how hazardous is your area. The first bullet I included is just to demonstrate that's from the presidential guidance, the Reopening of America plan. So it says to close common areas where personnel are likely to congregate and interact or enforce social distancing protocols. So practically, the way to do this is we suggest you walk through your workplace from the area where people come in first, and then their ultimate destination. So do this for clients, customers, employees. What does a day look like? And where are people going to be? What are they going to touch often? So some of this is dictated by the space you have. And if you have more than one location, you may have different protocols in different locations. So if you have a small kitchen or a small break room or a large break room or large conference rooms, you may be able to have safe social distancing in those areas, or you may not. You may need to put protocols in place so that only a certain number of people can be in these areas at one time. The same with, part of the reason to not have people come in to work all at the same time and come back to normal all at once is you don't want everyone standing at the elevators at the same time, or even in the parking lot at the same time. You don't want people, queuing in any areas. And then look at your ventilation. This is, I think, not recommended yet by the CDC, but is an option. And then, well, it's not recommended, I think, for the lower levels, but again, check your industry and what's required. Frequent cleaning and disinfecting of your workspaces is required. There is a cleaning product list online, but you should definitely train your employees on how to use and store the new materials that you're going to be using. And that's required by OSHA as well. New cleaning protocols, you may need to have additional cleaners. You want to rethink shared equipment and things like, you may want to assign sort of one person to go in a supply room, or certain individuals to be for certain shifts to do certain things, so that not everyone, again, is going into the same places. And determine which parts of your building your landlord has control over, and which is yours. So then for the people part, this is essentially how to social distance at work. It's required by the CDC and the state of Idaho. And we've talked about returning to work in phases or shifts. I will say on this issue, be aware of discrimination and sort of equal treatment. If you remember when, there are certain essential businesses and certain non-essential businesses under each state's order, what you are essentially doing is deciding who are essential employees, perhaps. If you decide, we need these people to go back first, we can't operate without all of these people. If you do it that way, and then look and see that all of those people are female, you might want to look and see if you recalibrate. We'll talk about vulnerable persons later. But part of preparing your people to work is perhaps surveying them in advance to find out what their vulnerabilities are, what the temperature is of their mental state. You'll have a lot of people in a lot of different places. And you'll want to communicate often on all of this. So next is communication. This is your opportunity to talk about your company in a way, that shows the public that you are taking care of your employees and your customers. So you want to think of all of these different entities on what type of communication, how often to communicate with them, is new signage required, and then have a way to monitor this and to keep communicating. So check in with people, do surveys, encourage feedback, and then remind employees if you have a health or wellness plan. We've talked about training. We've seen some people do a safety huddle at the beginning of the day. You may need to train people as part of the onboarding again, so before they go back into work. Obviously, you need to think about if you're going to do that in person, socially distanced, or in teams. And I should say one of the other things that's recommended is looking at if you can sort of cross-train people to do other people's jobs, or if you want to bring back certain teams of people and then swap out teams of people. A lot of medical entities are doing this so that, for example, all of their physicians and medical staff don't get sick at one time. And then I think lots of people will talk about documentation, but make sure you do that. So I've just included this business travel slide just as an FYI. There are separate, one of the things that bumps you up into a higher category of risk is travel. So you need to look at travel of your employees and continue remote meetings, reschedule conferences. And then I will go briefly over PPE and face coverings. The CDC has information on face coverings at work and how to wear it, how to put it on. So you'll want to use that as a resource. And just know that, oh, next slide, Jason. You should understand the difference. This is, I think, a picture from the CDC between surgical masks and respirators. Obviously, first I should say Idaho is a state that only recommends wearing masks. Many states require it. Idaho does not. But you'll want to look at what is the best practice for your industry, what are your employees doing, and in which situations will they need to wear face covering. I just put that slide up to show you that you do not need to get a fancy mask. So the CDC just recommends cloth face coverings. And then OSHA recommends allowing workers to wear masks over their nose and mouth. And then the last slide was sort of a picture of surgical masks and respirators. You don't need either of these, but we have seen people doing those. And then personal protective equipment technically covers gloves and many other things. And the CDC actually says you don't need PPE unless it's something that's already routinely recommended, and that other things are more effective, but that you should look at basic or just getting the basic ones. But some employers are buying some that are not hospital grade, but look like surgical masks. Okay, you can skip my last slide, Jason, so we can get on to other people.
Great, Amy, thank you very much. It was a great overview of Idaho's roadmap to reopening, and thanks for the information also on PPE. For those of you that joined the call a little bit later, the webinar a little bit later this morning, please know that we will be circulating a recording and today's slide deck. Also, please feel free to submit any questions via the chat function to me, Jason Castor, the host, or any one of our panelists. I'm now going to turn the time over to Christina Jepson, who's going to cover screening and temperature checks. Christina?
Great, thank you, Jason. So screening and temperature checks can be really important. They're tools that we have as people come back to work to try to keep this virus out of our workplace, as Amy discussed. Now, I mean, normally in a normal situation, employment lawyers would not be telling employers that asking people about symptoms, asking people about diseases, asking people, to take their temperature, that wouldn't be appropriate. But this is a very different time. And the CDC and other entities have said that, it is appropriate to do these things, of course, during this time, and that these are really important tools for trying to keep our workplace safe. But a few things to remember, if you're going to do temperature taking, which I think is something you should really consider doing, and symptom screening, you have to be non-discriminatory. You can't just do it for some groups. You can't just do it for older workers or just do it for, certain people with illnesses. You have to do it for everyone. It would be best to do it for everyone, and that means management and non-management. It's also critical that this information is kept confidential because it is medical information. And just like all medical information in HR, you have to keep it in a separate file. It should only be shared on a need-to-know basis. There's a lot of stigma with COVID-19, so people are going to want to protect their identity. You should also keep a log of either all the temperatures you take, or at least the ones that are above the limit you set, and any positive COVID-19 symptoms, any exposure, and again, those logs need to be carefully maintained and kept confidential. Once you've decided, what sort of symptom screening and temperature taking you're going to do, you should have a written policy. This is something we can help you with if you would like. And it starts with really, with temperature taking, is to set some kind of criteria. What is the temperature that's going to keep someone out of the workplace? The CDC says that a temperature of 100.4 is a fever, and no one should come in the workplace if they have that fever. You could even go a little bit lower. Some of our clients are going as low as 100 degrees, so that's something to keep in mind. You need to train people on the policy and procedure. Let people know in advance. You don't want to surprise people. And then, of course, follow your procedure and document all the actions you're taking. This is really so that you can show you're keeping your workplace safe, and if there's ever a lawsuit down the line, you have the evidence that show that you did everything you could. In terms of symptoms, this is another really critical way of keeping the virus out of your workplace, and that is asking your employees before they come to work or right as they come to work if they have any of the symptoms of COVID-19. So it's important that you keep up on what the symptoms are, because they have changed over time and they continue to change as we learn more about this virus. You can ask people this verbally, you can use apps, you can use surveys that you send to people on their computers. There's a lot of ways to do this, but just having them go through, answer the questions, and find out if they have any of the symptoms. If they do, they should be sent home and not come back to work until they're cleared, which we'll talk about more in a minute. You should also ask people about exposure. On the previous slide, note that they've had exposure to the virus. Okay, you could go ahead and go forward, Jason. So how are you going to take temperatures if you're going to do so? You can either have employees take them at home and report them to you, or you can take them at work. Either way, you need to start early to make sure you have all the things you need to do that. Not everyone has a working thermometer at home. I still don't have one. I ordered one a couple months ago, an infrared one. It arrived and it didn't work. So these are hard things to get. So whether you're going to do it at workplace or home, you're going to need thermometers. At work, you're going to need masks, cleaning supplies. Try to get the infrared ones if you can, because you can keep a further distance from an employee. With an infrared, you don't have to come in contact with them. Next. If employees are going to take their own temperatures at home, of course, you're going to need to train them on how to do that, what's expected, what kind of equipment is appropriate, make sure they have access to thermometers, know what the procedure is. Are you just going to trust them to take it and report it? Are you going to require them to take a photo or do it live with you via Zoom or FaceTime, something like that? It just kind of depends on your business. If you're going to take temperatures at work, you need to figure out early who's going to be in charge of that. Obviously, it needs to be someone very responsible, someone you can count on to do this in a way that is safe and do it in a way where they're going to really apply the policy. It could be someone at work who has some medical training, if you're lucky enough to have someone with EMT training. It could be someone you hire to come on site to do it. Some larger companies are doing that. Or you're going to have to get someone up to speed and trained on how to do that. Now, if someone's going to be taking temperatures at work, they have to have PPE. They have to have a mask. It kind of depends on what you're doing. If they have infrared and they can stay 6 feet away, maybe just a simple mask will be enough. But if they're going to be closer, you're going to have more protective gear because they're going to be potentially exposed to positive employees. Now, just like we talked about with everything else in the workplace, social distancing, minimizing crowds, cleaning equipment, all of those things apply equally to temperature taking and symptom screening. You need to make sure that you're not having people crowd together as they come into the workplace, getting in a big line together to have their temperatures taken. You have to keep people spaced out. Hopefully maybe have a separate room where they go into, have some privacy. You need to think about all those things. You need to clean the thermometer between each temperature taking. This is really critical. You also need to make sure you compensate people for time involved with screening, and if someone refuses, you need to figure out what you're going to do. I mean, if they really truly refuse after they're educated, after you've told them about your policy, you're going to have to take action because they can't come into the workplace. Okay, next. In terms of doing temperature taking at work, there's a few options. It's best if you can do it before they enter the workplace, because think about it. Once they enter the workplace and the further they come into the workplace, they're potentially exposing your entire workplace to the virus if they have it. So you don't want someone to kind of wander through the workplace and then find out they have a temperature, because then you're going to be sending everyone home. So the earlier you can do that before they enter, the better. So you could do it outside in the parking lot. That would be ideal. You could have some sort of drive-through temperature taking. You could set up a trailer outside. If they are going to come into your facility, you should do it right at the beginning when they first walk in. You should set up your area there so that you're protecting the rest of your workplace. You also have to know what your policy is about failure to pass. When is an employee considered not passing? Well, they wouldn't pass if they have a fever, if they have any of the positive symptoms, and or if they've been exposed. And then you need to figure out, can they work remotely? If they're very sick, obviously they're not going to be able to do that. You need to follow up with them to find out if they've been tested, and you're also going to have to find out all the people they've been exposed to at work, and whether those people are going to have to be sent home for quarantining. In terms of a return to work procedure, these are the CDC guidelines about exactly when someone can come back to work once they've either tested positive, had positive symptoms, had a fever, or had exposure. They either have to be symptom-free for a period of time, or they have to have documentation from their healthcare provider. No one should come back to work unless they meet these guidelines. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about protecting vulnerable persons or high-risk persons. This is one of the most important parts of successfully bringing people back to work, because we really can't have people back at work if we can't protect our most high-risk people. Because as we know so far from this virus, older people and people with certain underlying medical conditions, if they get it, they're a lot more likely to get very ill or even die. And we don't want that. So we need to protect people. But it's really tricky because, as you all know, as HR professionals, the ADA really limits what we can ask people about these sort of issues. And yet we're being told by the government right now that we need to protect these people. And we also can't discriminate against these people and just, sort of keep them out of the workplace and not pay them and not give them incomes because they're potentially high risk. So what do we do? First of all, keep up on what the high risk conditions are. And there's a few things you can do, and you can go to the next slide, Jason. What I'm really suggesting that employers do is come up with a new policy, a new sort of ADA policy where employees can self-disclose and self-identify, and they're encouraged to do that if they're in a high-risk category. So if they have one of these conditions, or if they're an older employee, or maybe some other reason. So, we really want to do that. You're not affirmatively asking them, requiring them to disclose, but really encouraging them to do that. And once you know about those high-risk conditions, you need to make all the special accommodations you can to keep them safe. Just as Amy talked about, that starts with keeping them teleworking if possible, because keeping them out of the workplace is the safest thing to do. If that's not possible, then you need to take extra steps at work to keep them safe. Now, like I said before, you just can't say, well, okay, we're not going to bring back people who are over 60 or pregnant or if they have an underlying condition. The ADA wouldn't allow that with big discrimination, but you've got to figure out something that's going to work to accommodate these people. On this slide, it talks about a number of things that you can do to try to protect high-risk individuals, whether it's allowing them flexibility, having a volunteer program about who's going to be back in the workplace, who's going to continue to work at home. You can have a questionnaire that just has a series of questions about potential risk factors where people can answer yes or no if they like and not go into the details about their risk. And, of course, letting people know that they can self-identify. And keep in mind that they may have leave rights under the Response Act. If an employee does self-disclose that they're in one of these high-risk categories, especially if it's a disability, one of those underlying health conditions, the ADA kicks in. You need to engage in the interactive process. You need to figure out what you can do to accommodate them, just like you would normally with an ADA condition, but now the government's asking us to even do more to accommodate more people. So sometimes I get the question, what if someone refuses to come back to work as these orders are put into place that the economy is reopening? And it really comes down to proceeding cautiously and talking to that employee about what their concerns are. Because it could be that their concerns are, in fact, that they're in a high-risk category. And if they are in one of those high-risk categories, as we discussed, you've got to figure out how to accommodate that. Now, if they're not in a high-risk category and you really talk to them and you figure out that they just are scared to come back to work, just generally afraid, and not because you haven't done everything you're supposed to in terms of protecting the workplace, but they're just not comfortable with it, then you might have to terminate their employment. But obviously you want to do that very carefully, and I would suggest that you do that with the advice of counsel. Okay, great. That's all I have, Jason.
Great, Christina, thank you very much. That was great information that you shared with us on testing protocols and vulnerable persons. I'm now going to turn the time over to Liz Mellum, who's going to talk about how to administer and enforce new policies and leave laws. Liz, welcome. It's nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. I understand that there have been previous webinars that have been offered to you, and many of you may already know the ins and outs of the leave that is required under the Response Act. So I'm going to do a brief overview of that, as well as dive into the types of documentation that you want to get from your employees to back up the paid leave that you are providing under the Response Act. Remember that, as Christina mentioned, as Amy mentioned, when your policies change, when your enforcement procedures change, and potentially disciplinary procedures change, we always want you to document that process. So whether that's maintaining paper files or electronic files, make sure that you are keeping the files up to date, that you are documenting for each individual employee. So as you know, the Response Act requires employers to provide paid sick leave and paid family medical leave in certain circumstances related to COVID-19. It's effective from April 1st through December 31st of this year. So the big question now is, how do you document the leave requests, the approval or denial of a request, and the credits that your business may claim as the result of the approved leave? And the answer there is carefully, consistently, and thoroughly. All documentation needs to be kept for 4 years. This is IRS guidance. That documentation does not need to actually be affirmatively submitted to the IRS when you're taking the tax credits, but you do want to maintain those records at your business in the event of an audit or some sort of question about your eligibility. The 4-year clock starts ticking either when that tax that you get the credit for becomes due or is paid, whichever is later. So the 4 years doesn't start from the date of the employee's request. It starts in relation to the tax credit. So the first aspect of this is just the basic required categories for any leave, of documentation for any leave under the Response Act. This is your employee's name, the date the leave is requested, and the date it's given, as well as the dates that they want the leave for. So for example, an employee may be wanting their full 2 weeks of paid sick leave because they're under a self-quarantine order. Or for example, they may be asking for 1 week of leave to care for a child. So make sure those dates are documented. They need to also provide support for their qualifying COVID-19 related reason for the paid sick leave being requested or for the FMLA leave, and our later slides are going to go through those in detail. The final piece that's required for any leave is a statement from the employee that they are unable to work or telework due to that qualifying reason. So with these next several slides, I have included a lot of information for you. I'm not going to read every single thing, but these are reference points for you. As Jason has mentioned, these slides will be released and sent to you after the presentation so that you can refer back to these. I have highlighted in these slides anywhere something is optional. If there's not a highlight that is optional, that means the document's required by the Department of Labor or the IRS in order to administer this leave. So for the paid sick leave portion of the Response Act, as we know, there's multiple reasons why an employee could take that leave, and there are different requirements for documentation under each type of leave. So the first is if the employee is subject to a government-issued quarantine or isolation order, you're going to want the name of the governmental entity and possibly a copy of the order. If they're under a healthcare provider's advice to self-quarantine, you want the name of the healthcare provider and possibly a note from the provider actually containing the directive. If the employee has COVID-19 symptoms and is seeking a diagnosis, remember that and is important for that reason. Your employee can't just say, I have a dry cough and a fever, I'm not going to come to work for 2 weeks, pay me. They need to also be seeking a diagnosis in order to have the paid sick leave. There are more things to document there. So you want to document the symptoms the employee is experiencing, whether they've had any recent travel or known exposure to a COVID-19 case, the medical diagnosis of COVID-19, when or if it's obtained, and the note from the healthcare provider that they are diagnosed or that they're being advised to self-quarantine. Now, under that category, if you'll flip back real quick, Jason, every single one of those items is optional. They are not required. So if your employee is refusing something, know that you can't say you have to give this to me because I need it, to comply with the law. It's something that each one of those categories is optional to help you administer it. The next reason is for the employee caring for persons subject to a government or healthcare provider's advice to quarantine. So similar to if it were the employee themselves, you need the name of the governmental entity that's ordered the quarantine or isolation, or the name of the healthcare provider, the name of the person the employee is providing care for, and the relation of that person to the employee. You also may optionally want to require a copy of the governmental order or a copy of the provider's advice. The final category, where an employee is caring for a child whose school or care provider is unavailable, this is also the category that qualifies them for expanded family medical leave. The documentation you'll want here is the name and age of each of the children that the employee is caring for, the name of the school or the provider who is unavailable, a written communication or notice of the closure or unavailability, and that portion, the written communication, is optional. And the last part is a part that came out with the regulations on April 1st, I think they came out, and is not been highlighted a lot. For the FMLA leave, your employee would need to provide a statement that there's no other suitable care provider available to care for the child. And if the child is aged 14 years or older, the employee needs to provide a statement of the special circumstances that exist that requires the employee's care during daylight hours. Those two pieces are important because the Department of Labor doesn't want, one parent who works at job A and one parent who works at job B both taking family medical leave at the same time. So the entire family is, out together for up to 12 weeks potentially. Next slide, please. So in addition to the paid sick leave portion, there's the family medical leave portion of the Response Act. The documentation needed here, remember, this is only available to your employees if they are caring for a child whose care provider or school is unavailable. So in addition to the basic categories of the name of employee, the date they're requested, and the fact that the employee is unable to work, you want, again, the name of the child that the employee is caring for, as well as the age, the name of the school or provider who's unavailable, and the statement that there's no other suitable person to care for the child. One big thing to remember here when you're administering the expanded family medical leave portion, this expanded family medical leave counts against the employee's already existing 12-week bank of FMLA leave. So if you are a business who has the number of employees that makes your employees eligible for FMLA leave, and you've already been administering this, the Response Act does not give an additional 12 weeks of leave. It's just another reason for taking those 12 weeks of leave. So you need to be sure that you have processes in place where you are already keeping track of leave that is taken, and so that you understand how any of this expanded leave may impact the availability of leave for your employees for the rest of their rolling 12-month period. For example, if you had an employee who had knee surgery back in October and they took 4 weeks of medical leave during that time, they only have 8 weeks available to them for this expanded family medical leave. So under those 8 weeks that are left, if they take 4 weeks for this expanded family medical leave, then you need to be keeping records that within their rolling 12-month period, they only have an additional 4 weeks left available to them. So make sure that you are documenting that and that you are understanding how it affects each of your employees. The final piece I want to talk about is just additional information to collect and retain. First of all, if you're going to deny leave, keep the documentation for why that leave was denied. You want that for a number of different reasons, and not the least of which is if the employee decides to pursue some sort of action thinking that their leave was wrongfully denied. If the leave was granted, you want documentation showing how you determined the amount of the qualified sick leave wages. So that's going to include their records of work and telework, the employee's regular hours of work per week, and how you determined their regular rate of pay. You also want documentation showing how you determined the amount of qualified health plan expenses that you allocate to wages, if that's applicable to your business. So some practical guidance here is what we have listed on the previous slides. You cannot ask for more documentation beyond those categories unless we get future guidance from the IRS or Department of Labor that additional documentation is required or allowed. The optional things are optional. The required things are required, and that's the extent of it right now. If we get additional information, you may have the ability to require more from your employees. As well as the last piece I'll give as a practical guidance is if it's possible for you in administering your payroll, establish a separate pay code for these leave entitlements. That will help you clearly track the leave and ensure that you have your tax credit calculations tracked and are able to be audited or corrected if needed at a later date. Thank you.
Hey, great job, Liz. Thanks for navigating those really difficult leave policy issues. I know we're short on time, but we do have one question. Liz, like many of us, we have children at home, and these children typically in the summertime are available to go to summer camps. With camps no longer available, does this make the employee available for extended FMLA?
Yes, so the lack of summer camps, if they are unavailable due to COVID-19 related reason, then yes, that would qualify, because the expanded definition, which I didn't include, I summarized it, is if the school, the place of care, or the care provider is unavailable. So a summer camp that a student or a child would normally be enrolled in, it not being available, that's a place of care, similar to a daycare location for a smaller child.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned, I know we're short on time, but I'm going to turn the time over to Sean Monson, who's going to talk about the issue that we all need to be aware of. What if somebody tests positive? Sean?
Thanks, Jason. And I'm not going to particularly necessarily go through these slides because we don't have time to go through the slides. So those will be there as a reference point for each one of you. Here's some of the main takeaways of what you need to do if you have an employee who tests positive for COVID-19. First thing you obviously need to do is, when that happens, is send the employee home. They need to be at home. They should not be at the workplace once you get word of a positive COVID-19 test. But when you do that, it's important to be humane. This is obviously going to be a stressful event in that employee's life. So you need to make sure that you try to be humane. You try to show empathy for that employee and what that employee is going to be going through after that positive test. The next really important thing to do is to do contact tracing, and that is looking at shift logs and time logs, figure out who that employee who may have been in contact with at the workplace. Those individuals need to be informed that there has been someone in the workplace who has tested positive for COVID-19. You do not disclose the name of the individual. You just tell them that there has been an individual at the workplace who has tested positive, that they either need to quarantine themselves for a 14-day period or they need to get tested. And if they come back and they get tested, they test negative, they can return to work. If they test positive, they should not be returning to work, and they should also be staying home. You need to make sure that you're aware of and follow the CDC guidelines regarding when people, after they have tested positive, when they can return to work. Christina talked about some of those guidelines, and make sure you're familiar with and that you reference those guidelines as you're making decisions about when employees who have tested positive or when employees who have interacted with an employee who has tested positive but haven't been able to be tested yet themselves, when they can return to work. So those are important guidelines to think about. The next thing you need to consider is, do you need to temporarily close your place of business to do proper cleaning? If you've got an employee who has tested positive, obviously there's going to be concern that the virus is in the workplace. So you need to consider how you're going to give your employees and your customers, if this is a retail place of business, that the site has been cleaned and that it is safe to return to the workplace. A couple of other things you should think about or need to consider is adopting and responding to requests for FFCRA leave that Liz just talked about. Obviously, if the employee is tested positive or if an employee is under a quarantine because of interactions with an individual who's tested positive, they potentially have FFCRA leave rights. You need to make sure that you properly administer and appropriately keep the records that was talked about. One thing that I will say about FFCRA, and I know my time is up, but it's interesting to me as I've talked to the number of employers that most employers have just relied on the Department of Labor's poster to essentially disclose to employees, tell employees about, and to administer FFCRA leave rights. There's a number of options that employers have and flexibility that the regulations give you and how you administer those rights. And it's important if you want to take advantage of those opportunities for flexibility that you create a policy and that details what those options are and how you might administer those leave rights. You provide it to your employees, and you, as the HR administrator, then administer those rights in accordance with the policy. But if you don't have a policy and you don't communicate that policy to employees, you're going to get a lot of resistance from employees if you try to take advantage of the flexibility that regulations give you in administering FFCRA leave rights. All the rest of the information is in the slides. It gives you additional guidance about what to do when an employee tests positive. So thank you.
Great, Sean. Thank you very much for that overview. I know we're bumping up against the top of the hour, and we've got one question that's come in. For those of you that are still with us, which is the majority of those that signed up from the outset, I'm going to turn a question to Liz. Liz, if an employee was on FMLA for maternity that began in November and now has no daycare for their child, is there an additional 12 weeks now?
No. So the FFCRA, the Response Act, does not allow for an additional 12 weeks of leave, just on the face of it. Now, there may be an issue with that employee's rolling 12-month period where their 12-month period started earlier in 2019 and it expired during the maternity leave and has started again, and that might provide for additional leave. But the FFCRA does not allow for an additional 12 weeks of leave. It is simply an additional reason that leave is available.
Great. Thank you very much, Liz. As we wrap up today, I want to extend a big thanks again to all of you who joined us for an hour this morning for today's webcast. As I mentioned from the outset, this webinar recording and our slide deck will be shared with you tomorrow. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to all of our presenters, Amy Lombardo, Christina Jepson, Liz Mellon, and Sean Monson. I'd also like to thank Justy Thomas and the Human Resources Association from Treasure Valley for co-hosting today's presentation with us. Justy, do you have any final comments before we conclude today? I get a shake of the head. That means no. So again, to all of you, we wish you, your colleagues, and your families all the best of health. Please let us know if you have any questions or if there's anything that we can do to assist you through these very difficult times. Thanks again for joining us today. Be well.
Thank you.